Good evening. This is Forum Daily News for Wednesday, March 2nd. I'm Nathaniel Duick, filling in for Nima Rajan. Today, the Bank of Canada has raised its key interest rate target by 1/4 of a percentage point to 0.5% to help fight inflation. It's the first increase since the rate was slashed to the rock bottom level of 0.25% at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. The higher rate is expected to prompt the country's big banks to raise their prime lending rates, pushing up the cost of loans linked to the benchmark, such as variable rate mortgages. The move comes as the annual inflation rate in January hit a 3-decade high of 5.1%, while the economy advanced by a stronger than expected 6.7% in the final quarter of last year. Well, meanwhile, Canada is slapping more sanctions against Russia in a bid to punish Moscow and choke off its military attack on Ukraine. In addition to closing Canadian airspace to Russian commercial planes, Ottawa is now also banning all Russian-owned or registered ships and fishing vessels in Canadian ports. Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly says Canada has asked the International Criminal Court to speed up its investigation into Russia for possible war crimes. Well, and continuing now with the issue of sanctions, Ottawa has started to dig into the finances of Russian oligarchs with assets and holdings in Canada. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland says the aim is to punish Moscow and choke off its military invasion of Ukraine. But she warns Canadians that future sanctions against Russian business interests here could cause some economic collateral damage domestically. Well, meanwhile, WestJet has announced a deal to buy Sunwing as competition in the Canadian travel market heats up. Financial terms of the deal, which will see Sunwing's current shareholders become equity holders in the WestJet group, were not disclosed. WestJet Chief Executive Alexis von Hohensbrake says the deal brings together two highly complementary businesses. The deal, which is subject to regulatory approvals, is expected to close late this year. Well, in other transportation-related news, union leaders are worried that steel from outside North America could be used to build part of the $5.7 billion Gordie Howe International Bridge. The bridge between Detroit and Windsor, Ontario, is set to open in late 2024. It's designed to ease commercial traffic congestion over the Ambassador Bridge. But while the bulk of the project is subject to U.S. rules that require the use of North American steel, two major components on the Canadian side, a customs plaza and an approach bridge, are not. Marty Warren, the National Director of United Steelworkers Canada, wonders why the federal government didn't insist on the use of Canadian materials. Well, shifting gears here, where Ottawa is looking to set a target to bring more Francophone immigrants to Canada as part of a drive to revive and protect French in the country. Official Languages Minister Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor introduced a raft of measures which include targeting immigration policy aimed at bringing more Francophone immigrants to French-speaking parts of Canada outside of Quebec. Still, the Bloc Québécois says the reform ignores repeated demands from Quebec and fails to acknowledge French as the only minority language in Canada and the only official language in Quebec. Well, a First Nations chief in northern Alberta says finding the grave of one child is too much, and finding many is incomprehensible. Chief Sidney Halcrow's comments came yesterday after another Indigenous community announced it had used ground-penetrating radar and a drone to discover 169 unmarked graves at a former residential school site northwest of Edmonton. Searchers focused on a small parcel of land around the St. Bernard School and planned to investigate two other areas. The school was opened by the Roman Catholic Church in 1894 and ran until 1961. Well, Health Canada is issuing a recall notice. The agency is warning that anyone with several models of the Fitbit Ionic smartwatch to immediately stop using the device because its battery can overheat and may cause burns. The agency issued a joint recall of the product with Fitbit and consumer protection agencies in the United States and Mexico. Health Canada advises consumers to contact Fitbit for a refund. And Team Canada has named its flag bearers for the opening ceremony of the Beijing Paralympics. Wheelchair curler Ina Forrest and hockey player Greg Westlake will together carry the maple leaf when the games kick off on Friday. Both athletes are looking for a fourth career Paralympic medal in Beijing. Well, we will be right back after the break with a look at the Bank of Canada's interest rate increase. I'll have a conversation with Tony Clement, host of Boom and Bust, up next. And of course, news from around the world. So stay tuned. The Bank of Canada raised its key interest rate target for the first time since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. The central bank increased its key rate by 1/4 percentage point to 0.5% in a bid to help fight inflation, which is at its highest level since 1991. The rate was cut to 0.25% in March of 2020 in order to help the economy amid the pandemic. But since then, the economy has rebounded, growing 6.7% in the fourth quarter of last year alone. Inflation, however, has also jumped to an annual rate of 5.1% in January. The Bank of Canada now says it expects inflation to be higher in the near term than it previously thought. Well, with us to discuss the interest rate, inflation, and what all of it means to Canadians is Tony Clement, the host of Boom and Bust. Tony, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
Well, thank you. Let's jump right into it. What does this new inflation rate mean, or interest rate mean?
Yeah, I think it's obviously a reaction to the inflation rate. And clearly the Bank of Canada, which had been signaling that at some point they had to move on interest rates when you're faced with an inflation rate that is high or getting higher, then at some point you do have to increase interest rates to dampen down the inflation. So that's what they've done. Obviously the markets have reacted positively to that. But what it does mean ultimately over the longer term is what's more interesting to Canadian consumers. Does it mean higher mortgage rates? Does it mean that the cost of food and other necessities increase? That's what people are going to be watching.
And we know Bank of Canada targeting a 2% rate, but we're at 5.1% annual one over in January. What is that? What are the implications of this?
Yeah, obviously our supply chains are distressed, and with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that's not going to go away anytime soon. And it means, therefore, that the costs of doing business are increasing for some of the necessities of life. It also means, obviously, when you look at the gas prices that are hitting us right now, that is probably going to continue and intensify, and that affects everything from transportation to food to the cost of a house ultimately. So these are things that are not going to go away simply because the interest rates are up 1/4 point.
Interesting you brought up transportation. Bank of Canada notes, the press release noted that food prices are rising. It's a continual issue. They're also talking about how rising fuel costs could impact this going forward. So how does energy costs factor into all of this?
Yeah, a fun fact, energy costs directly are not a part of the Consumer Price Index basket of goods. Huh. But, of course, they do impact, energy costs do impact the price of food. They do impact the costs of owning a house because you have heating costs and energy costs with respect to your house. So they have an indirect cost in all of these things that are included in the CPI index. So I think the Bank of Canada recognizes that and is factoring it into their calculations.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think you mentioned that their housing, always a perennial issue, housing affordability. How is this going to impact? It's a small rate increase, but will that impact housing affordability for Canadians looking to get in the market?
Interesting question. I would expect that most people who are invested in housing are going to look at the longer term. Is this a 1/4 point blip and then everything's going to be static, or is the interest rate going to continue to climb? If the interest rate continues to climb, obviously that'll have an impact on mortgage rates. Banks will charge more for mortgages, and ultimately sometime down the line that'll have an impact on the demand of houses. And if the demand collapses, then perhaps that has an impact on pricing of houses too.
Yeah. Going back, taking a bigger step, obviously the Ukraine, being invaded by Russia, it's one of the bigger issues of the day. How do you see this impacting the global markets in general, the economy of our global economy?
Right. And so, important question. Clearly, the biggest impact so far is on oil and gas. Russia, it represents 8% of the oil market. They put onto the market every day 4 to 5 million barrels of oil. 900,000 of that goes to the United States of America and still goes there. So if that is somehow constricted by sanctions in the future, hasn't happened yet, that'll have an impact on the cost of oil. And because there's only so much oil being produced, and therefore they have to get it from somewhere. If they can't get it from somewhere, the price is going to go up.
Coming up after the break, we'll be discussing whether the crippling sanctions on Russia being implemented by nations around the world will be enough to end the assault on Ukraine. We'll be speaking with the Honourable Stockwell, consultant and former international trade minister, about the most recent developments in Russia and Ukraine and what to watch for as that situation continues to unfold. So stay with us. We'll be right back. As world powers continue to react to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, questions remain about whether crippling economic sanctions on the powerful country would be enough to end the ongoing invasion. Canada and other Western allies have targeted Russia's finances and economy. This, while Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly is pushing the International Criminal Court to speed up its investigation into Russia for possible war crimes. Well, joining us now to help unpack these developments is the Honourable Stockwell, consultant and former international trade minister. Mr. Day, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks, good to be with you.
So let's start with an overview of the sanctions currently imposed on Russia since the invasion and how they're impacting the country.
Well, I think they're well intended. We also are of the view that these sanctions should have been put in place earlier, and it takes a while. Historically, as you know, sanctions don't usually work. The way they may work this time, as your viewers know, recently they've started hitting the so-called oligarchs. These are the guys who are the multi-billionaires, and they're only billionaires because Putin gave them entire industries to run on a monopoly basis. So when they see their assets reducing in value or in fact drying up, they're going to put pressure. The hope is they put pressure back onto him. And then so you go from that level, then go all the way down to the street level where people like you and I live. And we've seen the lineups at the ATM machines, the lineups at the banks, as the so-called SWIFT system, the world bank transfer system, starts to close in on people. They're not going to be able to get their money out. So what the hope is there, that there's a two-pronged pressure that's going to squeeze him into realize he's made some bad decisions here.
Yeah, and you mentioned that sanctions are not necessarily always effective, but are you seeing an improvement on sanctions being used in this case on the street level in Russia?
Well, we think so. It's difficult to get it out. And as you know, in war, the truth is always the first casualty, but it looks like it's having some impact. They're making the statement on not bringing in Russian oil. That's important, or Russian petroleum products. Again, too late. And I think it'll help us to have the discussion in Canada, hopefully when this is over, hopefully not too long from now, in terms of why do we rely on oil and gas from these terrible regimes while we shut in our own oil and gas. So hopefully that'll open up that discussion here.
Yeah, interesting to mention, oil and gas imports being banned. How significant is oil and gas exports to the Russian economy?
Think of it this way. That's a great question. When I was Minister of Finance in Alberta, and of course Alberta was all about oil and gas, direct oil and gas effect on the budget was around 19-20%, something like that. So it's significant. But in Russia, we're talking 40, we're talking 50%, depends on their sales principally into Europe. So if they could have access, but if we'd quit closing down the pipelines, if we could have access to North American high-grade, highly refined natural gas, they wouldn't have to rely on the Russian component of that and be at the mercy of the Russian government and of Putin.
So I suppose really the big question here is, will these sanctions have impact on Russia's military actions in Ukraine currently?
That's probably, in terms of direct intervention on their forces now, probably not. I've just got from about 2 hours ago, regional reports from around Ukraine that I shared. Some of these similar one I shared on air here with you a couple of days ago. But you've got like in Lviv, which is about 450 miles from Kiev. There's this network that I'm in touch with. They run women's shelters, they run men's rehab centers, they run orphanages. All of those communities are under threat. They're taking kids out of orphanages. This is happening in Lviv itself. The population of Lviv has doubled because people are rushing in there and there's no homes there's left to fill. There's hotels they can't get. They're sleeping in cars. And then if you go down to Lux, which is in the northwest, situation there where missiles have just hit the airport there. Thankfully, the planes were gone, but they're close to Belarus there. So they're exposed if Belarus starts to get in. In the city, again, to the north and the west, these are in areas that Putin claims that really are Russia anyway. But in Zhytomyr, which is north of the border and to the west there, we talked with an individual who'd taken his family to the border. And of course, he wasn't allowed to cross. He's got to go back and fight. 17 people in their van. But the locals really trying to help them out. They're bringing food.
Absolutely,
the long lineups of people trying to cross the border.
We're going to have to cut it there. Sorry, Mr. Day. We'll have to pick that up another time. Thanks for joining us.
All right, some very interesting, impactful stuff happening there.
Mm-hmm. Russia renewed its assault Wednesday on Ukraine's second largest city in a pounding that lit up the skyline with balls of fire over populated areas. The continued onslaught against Kharkiv came even as both sides said they were ready to resume talks aimed at stopping the new and devastating war in Europe. It was not clear when new talks might take place or where, or even what they would yield. Ukraine's leader earlier said Russia must stop bombing before another meeting. Volodymyr Zelensky has decried Russia's bombardment as a blatant terror campaign. And U.S. President Joe Biden says if Russia's President Vladimir Putin doesn't pay a price for the invasion, the aggression won't stop at just one country. Well, staying with the U.S. President now, where he addressed a concerned nation and anxious world, U.S. President Joe Biden vowed in his first State of the Union address to check Russian aggression in Ukraine, tame soaring U.S. inflation, and deal with the fading but still dangerous coronavirus. President Biden announced that he and all members of Congress, whatever political differences there may be, were joined with an unwavering resolve that freedom will always triumph over tyranny. He also announced that the U.S. is working to seize assets of Russian oligarchs and is following Canada and the European Union in banning Russian planes from its airspace. Meanwhile, Ukraine's defense ministry said early Wednesday it had evidence that Belarus, a Russian ally, is preparing to send troops into Ukraine. This, while a senior U.S. defense official said Russia's military's progress has been slowed, plagued by logistical, supply, and morale problems. The UN General Assembly will vote on a resolution demanding that Russia immediately stop using force against Ukraine and to withdraw its military. Meanwhile, China's bank regulator says Beijing won't join the U.S., Canadian, and European governments in imposing financial sanctions on Russia. China is a major buyer of Russian oil and gas and has refrained from criticizing Moscow's attack on Ukraine. Mexico's president also says his country will not be imposing economic sanctions on Russia. This in an effort to maintain good relations and open channels with all world governments. Russian investment in Mexico is estimated at some $132 million US, and bilateral trade worth more than $2.4 billion. Amid rising oil prices, the leaders of OPEC and its oil-producing allies are sticking with their plan to gradually increase production. The coalition, made up of OPEC members led by Saudi Arabia and non-cartel members led by Russia, chose today to increase oil production by 400,000 barrels per day in April. Since July, the OPEC Plus coalition has been adding that amount of oil each month to gradually restore deep cuts to production that were made early in the COVID-19 pandemic. Thick black smoke billowed across the grounds of New Zealand's parliament today, and sirens blared as hundreds of retreating protesters set fire to tents, mattresses, and chairs. It appeared to be the final act of defiance as police broke up the camp that demonstrators protesting COVID-19 mandates first set up more than 3 weeks ago. The convoy protest and occupation of the grounds and the surrounding streets was inspired by a similar protest in Canada. Meanwhile, Australia's largest city is preparing for dangerous flash flooding as population centres further north begin a massive cleanup operation. Record floods claimed at least 13 lives along Australia's east coast in recent days. Torrential rain is now forecast for Sydney and surrounding areas today and early Thursday. Dozens of suburbs remain flooded in Brisbane after its main river peaked on Monday. Well, Sony is donating $2 million as humanitarian aid to Ukraine through the United Nations Refugee Agency and aid group Save the Children. The Japanese electronics and entertainment company has already said it will halt theatrical releases in Russia. Earlier this week, Miki Mikitani, chief executive of the Japanese online retailer Rakuten, donated $8.7 million to the Ukrainian government through the embassy in Japan. Well, the moon is about to get walloped by a big piece of space garbage. The leftover rocket will slam into the far side of the moon on Friday. Experts think it's from a Chinese launch in 2014, but China's dubious. No matter whose it is, the litter will carve out a crater on the moon that could fit several semi-tractor trailers. Well, I'm Nathaniel Duick, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, visit our website at thenewsforum.ca and be sure to follow our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also follow our other commentary programming and News Forum on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.